Thank you, Sharon. I'm using the word liminal here deliberately because I see it as a word that, on the surface of it, applies very well to river fords, given that they often are on physical, or by definition are on physical boundaries. But I also see it as a word which lends itself to the thought processes that one has as one is investigating sites, whether it be through fieldwork or through desk work or museum work. And it's in that spirit that I'm going to revisit this word on a number of occasions as we go forward here. So Broadboyne Bridge is a place on the River Boyne, halfway between Navan and Slane in County Meath, that may be familiar to some of you for a variety of reasons. Those of you who follow the archaeological journals will know that in 1974 a passage tomb was discovered on the south bank of the river, just in this area here, and was recorded by George Ogan. And that discovery must have heartened the mind of a dead man, John O'Donovan, who must have smiled in his grave when he heard of this discovery, because he had championed the idea that Broadboyne was the site of Brú na Bóinne, the famed cemetery of megalithic and later remains, which we now know is located within what is loosely called the Bend of the Boyne. But he had championed the idea that in some way or another, Broadboyne preserved a name which was cognate with Brú, as in Brú na Bóinne. So those are reasons why you may have come across this rural location in County Meath. The first liminal point that I came across, as it were, or experienced in relation to this, is that I actually found something before I knew that I was looking for it. And if that seems a strange concept, I hope I can explain it to you. And that is as follows, that in January and February this year, I was doing some work on river fords further downstream, fords associated with the Battle of the Boyne. And I have been trying to publish a number of papers, one of which appeared in the Journal of Irish Archaeology this year, on fords which were used by the Williamites but predate the Battle of the Boyne. In other words, that Williamite intelligence was using existing fords for strategic purposes during that great battle. And in the course of doing that work, I decided I would see if the following applied, and that is whether barony, parish and townland boundaries might be converging on the river at these fording points. It's a thesis that I've been trying to develop over previous years in relation to the criteria and i.e. the characteristics of river fords. Is there an overlap between river fords and boundaries? So I counted up all the boundaries that were convergence points for boundaries between Navan and Baltray. It's a distance of about 37 kilometres. And lo and behold, I was, in a sense, disappointed when I found out that there were 30 instances where 3 or more townlands met in the river. Now, the Boyne is a major topographic boundary, so therefore one might expect townland mearings to respect the river. I then checked to see how the civil parishes worked and found that there were 13 instances where 3 or more parish boundaries converged on the river. And again, I was neither surprised nor disappointed by this, but wondering whether, if you got 13 examples of 3 or more parish boundaries, whether it reflected the presence or could it be tied into river ford patterns. And lastly, I was surprised, as it were, to find that only one instance of 3 or more barony boundaries meeting in the river could be established using this very basic method of just counting boundaries, using the first edition of the Ordnance Survey map to do so, where these boundaries are often clearly delimited. And that one point was at Broadboyne Bridge. So this idea sat in my head for a number of months. I looked at the maps for Broadboyne and thought, that's interesting. I wonder what is Broadboyne? I'd never been there. And this is the first edition of the Ordnance Survey map of Broadboyne with the bridge clearly delineated. It's 1837. And the boundaries here, I've exaggerated the colour to bring them out. The convergence, as you can see, of on the left, the Navan Barony meeting Slane Barony, where the bridge is, and then leading across the river heading south brings you into the Barony of Screen, or the townland of Ardmulchan. And then very close by, and you can see it on the right-hand margin, is the townland of Dollardstown, which is in the Barony of Lower Duleek. So you have 4 baronies meeting, not exactly meeting in the one point in the river. 3 of them are converging on the bridge, but one of them is just downstream from what is called Stackallan Mill. And the feature that attracted my attention when I looked at this map for the first time was the Gothic lettering which marked out the name Luggery, meaning the pool or hole of the king. And I was wondering to myself, what significance had this got? I didn't do very much research on it at the time. So that's the state of play I had in my mind, as it were, the inception of something just on the edge of my consciousness, when I went to the National Library a couple of months later. And something else occurred which kind of caught my imagination, and that is that I recognized, when looking at an old navigation map of the Boyne Valley, that the English name of the bridge where the baronies met, Broadboyne Bridge, matched the name of a mysterious river ford. Now, I'm being a little bit obscure here because Broadboyne Bridge is a peculiar place in that it has an A1 grade bridge, beautifully built, early 18th century bridge. But that bridge, right to the present day, has a multiplicity of names. So, in no less a place than the Westmeath, the Meath Chronicle, only 2 years ago, a local reporter complaining about safety issues in relation to the fringes of the river at this point, mentioned that Broadboyne Bridge is also called the Bridge of the Boyne, and it's also called Stackallan Bridge. And I've checked this out since, and everybody in this part of Meath is absolutely familiar with using these 3 names for the one place. But it's the 4th name that set me off on this research project. That is, that in the 18th century, this bridge was not called by any of those 3 names. It was called Brayford Bridge. And Brayford is a direct translation of a name which occurs in medieval manuscript sources called Áth Brea. So this set off a whole series of sparks in the aging brain that I have that suggested to me that I was onto something. This is the map in question, spread out on the table in the manuscript room in the National Library. I think it's about the 23rd of May, because I've started to investigate my own historiography, as it were, as to where was I on certain dates when these things came into my, conceived in my head, these connections. This is the most interesting map. It was drawn in 1748 by a man called Thomas Steers, who was an engineer, but an interesting character because he'd actually fought at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. He laid out a scheme for the navigation of the Boyne and was involved in the construction of Old Bridge Lock, but died shortly afterwards, I think about 1752-53. So he wasn't involved in the works further upstream. And if you know the history of the Boyne navigation, you know that these works were carried out in 2 phases. One from about 1748 to 1760, and a second phase then from about 17 90 to 1800. And as a result of that, the river was then navigable, albeit difficult to navigate, but it was navigable up as far as Navan. The point on the map we're going to look at is just emphasized by this little square that's appearing roughly at top center. And it brings us to Broadboyne, which we've already looked at on the first edition map. The emphasis here on this map has been, I've blown it up here as it appears on the left on the map, and then I've turned it through 90 degrees so you can read the names, both the name of the bridge as it's given here, Brayford Bridge, rather than Stackallan Bridge, Bridge of the Boyne, or Broadboyne Bridge, which in fact is the official name of the bridge. And also the map registers the fact that there is a mill, which is now called Stackallan Mill, just downstream, and a weir associated with that, represented by the black line crossing the river. The eye on the map is one of a series of features drawn by Steers, which weren't existing in 1748, but they were part of his idea for a scheme of weirs and what he called winches. And it's not quite clear what he meant by the winch. It seemed to have been the idea that when boats were traveling upstream, they could be winched through weirs and then set on course again using the towpath to go further upstream. Whereas on downstream, they would presumably run through the weirs with just the assistance of the current. At any rate, this name completely set me back, because Brayford, in its Irish form, Áth Brea, had been in my head when I was looking at fords downstream. I had at one point thought that the ford at Bro, near Newgrange, which is the subject of the paper I've written in GIA, that might be cognate with Brie. So Brie or Áth Brea might be the same as Bro Ford. But I've been counselled by a number of Irish scholars to stay away from that there's two phonetic sounds here and they have different origins. What we can say about Brayford is that it's the same sound as the word Bray, County Wicklow. And there is a bit of a mystery over the derivation of Bray as a place name. It seems to be perhaps derived from the river, which runs through the town of Bray. But there are also characters in early medieval literature who bear the word Bray, both male and female. So I'm going to kick that into touch, as it were, the etymology of Bray. Bray features as Áth Brea and also just as Bray, as you can see there, in the Historical Dictionary of Gaelic Place Names, which are an amazing resource that's been produced in UCC under the Locust Project, led by Pádraig O'Riordan and currently by Kevin Murray, but others such as Diarmuid O'Murchada were involved in it from its inception in 2003. This is the cover of the initial volume. I think it's gone to 8 different fascicles to this date. And you can see here some of the details from the manuscript sources. You can see very clearly that AFM would stand for the Annals of the Four Masters, etc. And it gives you extracts telling you something about the references to Áth Brea. And quite clearly, as you look through that, you can see the word Fionn occurring, indicating that it has an association with Fionn McCool. Now, Fionn McCool is a fascinating character. Given the, I suppose, the course of my own research in the last 10 years or so, which has been associated with trying to look at the place names of Táin Bó Cúailnge, that great medieval epic, I have been preoccupied by figures like Cuchulainn, Maeve, and Alil, etc. And these figures are all very, very much part of, I suppose, the panoply of great celebrities of medieval literature. But to follow an analogy that Kevin Barry, one of my favourite modern writers, might follow, he was comparing W.B. Yeats and Joyce in a short story some years ago, and he described Joyce as being perhaps of snob value, but when you got to W.B. Yeats, you were talking of box office. And I have a certain sense that Cuchulainn has a certain currency in a line north drawn from RD to Sligo. But when you get to Fionn McCool, you are into box office territory. So to be able to say that I think I found the place where Fionn McCool died has a certain, would probably get you a half pint, a Guinness in a couple of pubs in just close to UCC in Cork, if not in other places. At any rate, it's an interesting association, and it's an association that is not universal, but is there in relation to quite a few historic fords. You can often find that fords are associated with what might be called celebrity characters. Not all fords, in fact only a minority of them, but where those fords have that celebrity association, they tend to be in a first order if you're to create a hierarchy of value around fords. And I'm speaking here in terms of literary and Dinshanachus value. Fionn McCool is a very, very complex character, as you all know. There is bad and good in him as a character in equal measure. One thinks immediately of the Tuascirt Brega and Laegaire, in which his cruelty and stubbornness comes across very, very forcibly. One of the features of the cycle of stories associated with him, which is called Fionnacht, or the Fionn cycle, is that there are very, very few accounts of his death. In fact, quite a few of the scholars who've worked on them, including Geraldine Parsons, will tell you that his death is a very minor theme in the accounts, the huge literature that's associated with them. And in fact, in many aspects of that literature, Fionn lives on. There's a touch of Elvis about him. And if he isn't quite with us in the world, he's asleep somewhere just waiting for the call. We might be giving him a buzz fairly soon. But he's a most fascinating individual in terms of his personality profile as much as his adventures. Geraldine Parsons, as this slide illustrates, has tackled the issue of the death of Fionn in a paper published in the Gaelic Finn tradition well over a decade ago. And what she has identified is that there's a pattern in the accounts of the death of Fionn McCool. She marks out that there are 31 distinct statements about it contained in 19 works. And these are works that would predate the 12th century, effectively. Predate the 13th century. These distinct statements are interesting because she immediately qualifies that statement, as it were, by saying that these are references to his death. Most of these 31 instances don't detail what happened to him, how he died. They just refer to the fact that he died. Sometimes it appears by his own hand, through leaping across gorges or rivers, trying to impress women, believe it or not. Sometimes he does this backwards to impress women, having done it forward first. In other instances, he is killed. And it's those instances where he's killed that are associated with Áth Brea or Brayford on the River Boyne. I should also add that the River Boyne location is not the only place associated with his death. The Slieve Luachar Mountains are mentioned, and a couple of locations in Waterford as well, that these are the places where he died. But as we shall see from Parsons' work, it is the most persistent tradition regarding him, and she breaks up these traditions of death into three different segments, is that he was killed by members of a unity or a polity called the Lunia. And this is marked out in 11 accounts out of a total of 31, so it's at least a third of them. And though she doesn't use do an analysis by location in the way in which she divides them up, she adds to the qualification that the first tradition, the idea of him killed by the Lunia, that it's most commonly located on the River Boyne and most commonly located at Áth Brea. So this brings us back to the river ford, as it were, and demands that we take a closer look at it. This is just some examples of the types of references that link Áth Brea to the death of Fionn. The earliest of these would be that in the very famous story, Fionn Bother in Navan, which is reputed to have been written by Cnéadú Harthacán, who was a chief poet, as it were, of Ireland in the late first millennium AD. And what you'll also notice from these are just 4 of 9 references to Áth Brea as a place where Fionn died, is that in the last one of these, in Dún or Finn, you can see that it's described as the Battle of Áth Brea, or Áth Brea in this instance, and it's associated with the Kingdom of Brega, which is right in the heartland of the current County of Meath. So this brings us to another, in my imagination anyway, in my processes, another of these moments that when I began to read into Fionn's literature, I began to remember something, and that is I'd come across Fionn McCool before, and I had been absolutely fascinated by the research that was done on him. And many of you will know what this research was because it's associated with the work of Elizabeth Fitzpatrick of the Archaeology Department in University College Galway. What her research did was give me, it gave me the strength, as it were, to say that Áth Brea on the Boyne is a special place. It might be the place that he died, but it's also a special place itself. And I say that with some certainty because in 2015, in the autumn issue of Archaeology Ireland, there's this one, what I regard personally as one of the best articles ever printed in this very august journal, and that is the wonderfully titled Decoding Fionn McCool's Places. And as the preliminary paragraph states there, this collaborative project between Elizabeth and a number of other colleagues, each bringing their own areas of expertise. Neji brought the philological elements to it, Ronan Hennessy and Paul Nasons, again, the fieldwork technologies that were necessary to work on this project. And it identifies Fionn McCool's places as exceptional landscapes of enriched natural resources. In effect, this paper is painting a picture that places associated with Fionn McCool, which are often called sea-fin locations, they bring together an intersection of mythology, geology, toponymy, and archaeology in the one location. So they're absolutely fascinating. And that's what animates this research project and makes it stand out. It's a flagship for what good research should be in this age of supposedly multidisciplinary research. So let's go back to Broadboyne and have a look at the archaeology of the place, because quite clearly in Liz Fitzpatrick's modus operandi, this would be one of the ways which you look at a location associated with Fionn McCool. So there's a very distinct pattern at Broadboyne of quite a lot of archaeological sites on the south bank of the river and near nothing on the north bank, which is strange. And given that this is a barony boundary, and also, it has to be emphasised, 4 civil parishes also meet at these locations. So each of these baronies has a parish which is separate. And not only that, these parishes, the centre point of each parish is in the townlands which mirror onto the Boyne. So Dunmow has the parish church of Dunmow Parish, Stackallan has the parish church of Stackallan Parish, etc. So there's a certain convergence here that is suggesting that this too is a Fionn place and it has special characteristics. Why there should be no archaeology north of the river may also be to do with something much more Dane, and that is the construction of Stackallan House in the early years of the 18th century by Gustavus Hamilton, who was one of the victors at the Battle of the Boyne and received huge swathes of land in Meath as a result. And it may be, in fact, there's quite good evidence that he reimagined the landscape in the radius of the house, and that radius extended down to the river, and in fact he may well have had a hand in the construction of Broadboyne Bridge itself, which was built probably sometime between 1710 and 1723 when he died. And of course, why did he build the bridge? Because it shortened his journeys going to and from Dublin. Otherwise, he would have had got 6 miles upriver, or 6 kilometres upriver to Slane, or 6 kilometres downriver to Slane, or upriver to Navan to make the same journey. So everything points to the fact that he may have had a hand in the bridge's construction. And if he did so, he may well have redrawn the barony boundaries, moving them to the bridge, whereas previous they might have been located downstream slightly. And that would be a normal feature of a bridge replacing a ford. So where was the ford? Was it underneath the bridge, as is often assumed by historians? Or in my own research into river fords, the bridge and the ford are seldom in the same location, because the requirements, the engineering requirements from a bridge, are seldom met at the point where the natural river ford occurs. So as it speculates here on the slide, I think the site of the ford was further downstream, close to the point marked number 4, Pool, which is the point we looked at earlier briefly, Lugaree. So what is Lugaree? We know absolutely nothing about it, and given that the Boyne navigation had raised the water level here in the 1790s, probably to about 3 foot above its pre-navigation height, it would have submerged the ford and probably submerged the pool as well, so that nobody locally seems to know anything about the place, to the best of my knowledge. But we have William Wilde stepping into the breach in 1849, and in his Beauties of the Boyne and Blackwater, he tells us that this is a deep pool immediately below the bridge and receives the name Lugaree, and that a pattern used to be held there some years ago, where it was customary for the people to swim their cattle across the river at this spot as a charm against the fairies and certain diseases. Now, swimming cattle in a river or driving them through fires at various of the 4 great quarter days of the Irish year is not, I'm not saying it's a universal tradition, but it's a well-known tradition. So swimming cattle in a river doesn't necessarily mean there's a ford there. But by the time William Wilde was recording it, that ford had been effectively effaced for a full generation. So it may be, I think this is a clue that Lugaree holds the key to the location of the ford. So there's Lugaree, marked on the map, 1837. What's fascinating about the map is that while the name is marked on the map in the river channel, there's no dot to indicate where Lugaree was. So it seems that the Ordnance Service surveyors weren't quite clear where it was. But we do know that it's above, just above the Stackallan Mill. And Stackallan Mill is fed by a very, very beautiful ford called Horseshoe Ford because of its shape. This is the Horseshoe Ford on the right-hand side here, below the arrow for Stackallan Gardlock. And the ford is, the weir, the Horseshoe Weir, is designed to divert the waters of the river to the north bank, where there's the entrance to a Gardlock to carry vessels down and upstream. And on the near bank, it carries the waters into Stackallan Mill itself. And Lugaree Pool is marked, broadly speaking, in the spot derived from the map. And the place, which is now known as Ardmulchan's Slipway, which, if you know this area, it's on Cotton Mill Road coming down to the river, is a hive of activity for canoe club people. Now, earlier on I mentioned that the manuscript accounts associate the demise of Fionn with a grouping called the Lunia. Their full name is the Lunia Tavrach, which commemorates their association with Tara. And Patrick Gleeson, who has been breaking new ground and filling very much the shoes of some of his predecessors. I notice a lovely volume called Shanachas out of the bookstall, Essays in Memory of Francis J. Byrne. And he's been taking, again, he's a young blood taking over the mantle of unravelling early Irish history, along with many others, but has produced some exciting papers, one of which is on a medieval polity called the Lunia Brega. And in the paper published in PRI in 2017, he tells us that many historians, in fact right up to the present day, confuse the Luine Brig, which are associated with the Barony of Morgallion in North Meath, with a separate polity called the Luine Teoruch. And that this separate policy, as he describes them himself in fascinating language, were an archaic but equally obscure polity of a militaristic imperative, perhaps synonymous or closely affiliated to Colman na Teoruch, meaning the columns of Tara. So this looks like a Praetorian guard whose job it was to guard the kings of Tara. Delving further into the delights of early Irish literature analysis, I found myself reading Kevin Murray, professor of medieval Irish in UCC, who tells us in the early Fionn cycle, published in the same year, that the enmity between Luine and the Fionn, in other words, why is Fionn killed by the Luine at this battle at Áth Brea, that it may be a reflection of the fact that Fionn usurped the role of the Luine as the Praetorian guard of the kings of Tara. And that caused this growing enmity between them, which is then enshrined in the story of Fionn's death at the ford at Broadboyne. This led me on further on a road of, what's the phrase somebody used earlier, God knows where, as cited by Barry Raftery, to have a look at the broader landscape associations of the ford at Broadboyne, and to look at barony maps. And you can see here that the barony boundaries converge quite clearly at Broadboyne, and that there is a cautionary tale to be told about using barony boundary analysis, and that's marked by the work of Paul McCotter, whose wonderful book, Medieval Ireland, published I think in about 15 years ago, gives us a whole understanding of the political and social landscape of early medieval Ireland. So when you take his map, which he says doesn't correlate very well with the barony boundaries, because barony boundaries were revised constantly in the post-medieval period. However, for the area around Broadboyne, there is a convergence, so that when you overlay his map onto it, you can see that Broadboyne Ford is right at the northwestern extremity of a trícha of Laegaire, which has a barony in it called the Barony of Lune, and Gleason's case is that the Barony of Lune is derived not from the Luine Brig, it's derived from the Luine Teoruch. So this polity, who are attacking Fionn on the northwestern boundary of the trícha of Laegaire, are, in a sense, their homeland is within that territory. And they are targeting Fionn, whose Praetorian guard, or Fionn, are protecting the king of Tara, and the proximity of Tara to that ford makes you think that this association may be a credible one. So, to conclude, fords are liminal points. They're at the edge of a lot of research that we do today. Even though we're a full generation almost into what is called landscape archaeology, we don't seem to have yet fully embraced the importance of routeway identification and the role that fords have in routeway identification, in that fords are fixed points. And they're given to us by nature, albeit they may change through time and they may be abandoned, and then new fords may develop depending on river course changes, etc. But they don't seem to have entered fully into our consciousness, certainly within the archaeological community. Murray Mhíbhreolcán in 2011 wrote a very memorable phrase at the end of a very fine article on the death places of the early kings of Tara, in which in the last sentence, she says that Fionn McCool dies at the mysterious location of Áth Brea. And it is a mysterious location. It is a real ford, however, and it seems that my identification is the first identification, just through the look of looking at a navigation map of 1748, to pinpoint this location for Fionn's death, the most likely location for his death, as it were. But it raises all sorts of questions which are well beyond my comfort zone. In other words, how and why did the association between this ford and Fionn McCool arise? And what were the scribes doing when they wrote the stories of Fionn McCool's demise? Were they basing it on an old contested boundary between two of the trícha céts of County Meath? And all of this offers an opportunity for disciplinary study. I did a count some years ago, published in Archaeology Ireland again, that there are 677 entries in the Dictionary of Gaelic Place Names, the historical dictionary, which could have the element "a," meaning the Irish for ford in them, and that the parallel Northern Ireland place name project run by Micheál O'Mannion and Kay Moore identified 210 records containing the name Ford, the English version of it. So all of this brings us back to liminality, as it were, and as I was putting this piece together yesterday and early this morning, it dawned on me that one of my favourite quotations from one of the best writers about physical heritage in Ireland, Eston Evans, is very apposite for what I'm about and maybe for what all of us are about today. And that is, it's at the fences, along the borders of disciplines, that discoveries are likely to be made. Thank you very much.